And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dana Zellman. I'm the liaison for Working Group 1, and want to welcome you all here today. But I think we're going to start off with some remarks from Admiral Simpson, so I'll invite him up here.
As soon as he takes his seat.
Oh. No pressure.
That's right. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our third meeting for the Task Force on Optimal Public Safety Answering Point Architecture, which may not mean a whole lot to most of America, but this is the future of 911, as you all know, and we really are at an inflection point where the changes in technology happening around us really should galvanize us to action on making sure that we don't wind up with a relic of a 911 system which is at risk from the changes around it with the Internet protocol, but also not recognizing the increased functionality that the new technology should afford it. So very pleased with the work so far. And let me thank each of the members of the task force here and on the conference bridge for continuing to devote concerted effort to this important task. Your participation in the face of a busy summer schedule, some of you took time away from vacations, and we appreciate that. It's a testament to your commitment to ensuring that Americans have the access to the best available emergency response system. Second, I'd like to thank the leadership of the task force and each of the working groups for steering the work effort so smoothly. Much has been accomplished since we first met in January, and the pace is certainly increasing as you head into the next 2 months to deliver upon each of your reports and produce a substantive set of recommendations. A major task on the horizon for 911 authorities is addressing that tech transition and deciding when and how to upgrade to next generation 911. Is it an evolution? Is it a big bang? Is it both? As you all know, the 911 system today is a patchwork quilt of old and new, and consumer technology has outpaced 911 technology in most regards. By leveraging and utilizing new communication tools and technologies that have become commonplace in recent years, Next Generation 911 will provide the public a more advanced system for reaching emergency services and will provide public safety professionals with better tools to analyze and respond effectively to emergencies. This includes the ability for PSAPs to send and receive information using text and multimedia messaging, as well as a number of IP-based communication platforms and functions. My staff and I met with the folks at the Department of Transportation last week, and Lori was a part of that meeting. It is just amazing, the technology just in automobiles that we see being introduced today and certainly in the near future. That technology will report to 911 call centers. We need to figure that out and make sure that that's adding value and not adding more risk than it adds value. But that's just one example of the many new inputs that we will see to 911 over the horizon. Next Gen 911 will inevitably raise novel governance questions as new technologies are integrated into the system, because these technologies will beget new roles and responsibilities, but also new opportunities. This task force is mapping the way. Today we'll hear progress reports from each of the three working groups. Working Group 1, under the leadership of Jay English, there's Jay, who is the director of APCO's Communications Center and 911 Services, and his group is studying and making recommendations for PSAP-specific cybersecurity practices based on the NIST cybersecurity framework and other foundational sources. David Hall, David, good to see you again, Deputy Director of Operations for the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency and the National Association of State 911 Administrators, representatives to the task force, and the state lead for where my daughter goes to college. So, David, I want you to do your job very well, your daytime job as well. Thank you very much. But David's been leading Working Group 2, study of optimal approaches to next generation 911 architecture implementation. To start our meeting, however, we will receive an in-depth report from Working Group 3. And we had always sequenced, or you all had always sequenced Working Group 3 to be a lead product. And so today we're very pleased that the chair of Working Group 3, Commissioner Phil Jones, from the Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission will be providing us that deep dive set of interim results. Working Group 3 is studying optimal resource allocation and budgeting for PSAPs as they transition to Next Gen 911 and models for sustainable funding of next generation 911 operations. Now, we recognize that there's an interdependency, an ultimate interdependency between the work of each of the three working groups, and I think Steve's going to talk later on about that. So we do want to think about, as we hear from each of the working groups today, that they have not yet been reconciled across groups yet. So what we're going to hear today, I believe, will be interim products, right, before that harmonization ultimately occurs. As a last word before I turn it over to our chairs, Steve Sauter and Dana Wahlberg, you are at the phase of the task force effort where the full weight of members and working group participants' expertise begins to bear fruit. We understand, however, that reaching consensus as you move forward towards final recommendations can be challenging. If there's anything that this group assembled today understands, it is challenging, sensitive, and urgent situations. I can't think of a better group to work on tough national challenges like that, national and local challenges. You may not all agree on every point, but consensus calls for compromise to arrive at measured results. But it's also okay to document where there may be more than one way to skin a cat, and that's okay. Again, I thank you for, and let me finish on that, but it's important that we skin the cat. So don't end with just identifying the two ways to skin the cat. We got to skin the cat. Thank you for your commitment to this effort, and I look forward to hearing the presentations. Steve's probably too proud to say it, but Steve is with us today after a bit of a harrowing experience, and an airbag fit in there somewhere, but this is the kind of commitment that this professional has to this very important issue. And Steve, thank you for making it here today.
Thank you, Admiral, and good afternoon to everyone. Personally, and I know on behalf of the task force members that are before me and those that are on the bridge, we'd like to express our appreciation to you, Admiral, and your staff for all of the assistance and the guidance that you have provided to us individually and collectively since the beginning, and certainly since we last met here 3 months ago. The Admiral's talked about my harrowing experience. It wasn't that harrowing, but it was interesting. And I have heard throughout my professional career people that have spoken about it. Did you ever have an airbag go off? And I had never, thank goodness, until this morning. So for those of you that have experienced that or heard about that, it is true. In about 4 hours' time, your chest will begin to ache, and by tomorrow morning it should look blue. So I'm all prepared for that. This has been an interesting 3 months. Since we were last here, this group has met diligently and produced some absolutely incredible work. We have taken this effort, this charge, as seriously as a group of people could. And when I speak, I'm speaking on behalf of the total group, including those that are on the bridge. We know that you have charged us with doing something that has never been done before, and to do that in an incredibly brief period of time. We understand that. As professionals, we have labored hard to adhere to that, and I also look forward to hearing from the three work groups, beginning with Work Group 3, today, as to where they are at this moment in time after this incredible effort. An incredible effort to which everybody at this table also had full-time jobs to attend to, and in a number of cases, conferences and meetings to go to. But nevertheless, we found time to do what we have done to this point in time. Where that will come out at the end of the day, I am very, very interested to hear. The work groups met informally this morning upstairs on the second floor. I was not able to participate because of what the Admiral referred to. Dana, thank goodness you were here and you sat in for me. I appreciate that. And I may very well ask you in a moment or two to kind of give you just a broad assessment before we begin the reports as to how that dialogue went today, because I was very encouraged by it from what I heard when I arrived at about noon. There were some common denominators and some common themes that went through that dialogue, and I'm sure that will surface itself during this meeting and maybe Dana's remarks as well. The Admiral jokingly said at the outset that the acronym for the Task Force on Optimization of PSAP architecture may not be a dinner table word, but we pledge to you that when we get done, it will be known in every household, in every house in America. You know, we will be sure that they know what this is really all about. Dana, do you wish to offer any remarks? Please do.
I just want to thank this group for the incredible work that they've done. It's an amazing team effort of many of us wear different hats and have so many different perspectives to share. And it's just amazing to me to watch how all of those things have come into helping to reach kind of a collaborative approach to this. And we look forward to having many more meetings to fine-tune and formalize our final product.
Thank you, Dana. You might recall at our last meeting, we led off with the task force chaired by Jay English, and we talked about and listened to all of the things associated with cybersecurity and how that factors into the next generation of 911. It was educational for many of us. Thank you, Jay, and your group. It continues to be a fascinating topic, and every day when you open the paper, it only refreshes in all of our minds the importance that we look at cybersecurity in relation to the rollout of next generation 911. But I would never begin this meeting with that same group because it is so fascinating that it takes about 2.5 hours to get through it. So we're going to defer this time to Philip, Commissioner, and we're going to ask that he take that same time and effort to explain to us the work product that you have developed with your team over these last 3 months, and then we'll move on to both Jay and to David. Phil? And before we do, hold on, I should do this, beg your pardon. For the record, can we go around the table beginning with Jay and just identify who we are, and then we'll go to the conference bridge as well. Jay?
Jay English, Director of Comp Center 911 Services with APCO International.
Brian Font, CEO of NINA.
Robert Brown, representing NIPSTIC.
Mario Durango, Vice President, System Architecture, Motorola Solutions.
Sean Petty, representing ICERT.
Mark Fletcher, Chief Architect with Avaya.
Jeff Wittix, Chief Strategic Officer with Airbus DS Communications.
Dave Hall, the Chair of Working Group Number 2, representing NASNA and also with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency.
Mary Boyd, Vice President, Government and Regulatory Affairs for Intrado.
Jim Gerke, CEO of the Texas 911 Alliance.
Tony Montani, Director of Verizon's E911 Engineering and Operations.
April Heinze, representing Michigan Communications Directors Association.
Dana Wahlberg, representing the state of Minnesota Department of Public Safety and Vice Chair for this group.
Lori Flaherty with the National 911 Program at the U.S. Department of Transportation.
Joe Heaps, U.S. Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice.
Philip Jones, representing NARUC and the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission.
Dusty Rhodes, the Office of Emergency Communications in the Department of Homeland Security.
David Firth, Deputy Chief of the Public Safety Bureau.
Tim May, PSHSB.
And our federal officials. That's true.
And designated federal officer.
Thank you all. And to those on the bridge, please identify who you are and what you represent.
Good afternoon. This is Chris Littlewood from St. Peter's College Center for Public Safety Innovation.
Thank you, Chris. Next.
Hi, this is Richard Ray, speaking through a sign language interpreter. I'm using video relay service.
Anyone else?
Larry Hatch, Oregon APCO NINA.
And one last call. And for our bridge participants, if you comment, and we hope that you do, please identify who you are, when you speak, so we'll have that for the record as well. Having said that, David, please, the floor is yours. Phil, the floor is yours. See, David, I tried to do it again.
Thank you, Steve. I'd first like to thank all members of Working Group 3 for their countless hours dedicated to this proposition of proper resource allocation and the fees and collection issue. It is not an easy issue. I'd also like to thank NARUC. Brad Ramsey is here in the room. Thank you, Brad. NARUC made the conference bridge available for Working Group. They provided some staff support. And, of course, the president of NARUC, Lisa Edgar, appointed me. I am speaking in my own capacity today as an individual commissioner, but also as an individual person who has been involved in 911 and communications issues for some time. I am very dedicated to the proposition that public safety and emergency communications needs to be updated and innovated for the Internet protocol era, which we are rapidly going into. We need to put this system on a firmer ground for our children and grandchildren. You have all received, I hope, a copy of the report that I sent out last Thursday or Friday. I want to emphasize a few things at the beginning. This is not a, quote, final report, even though the word final is on the front page. This is a work in progress. We will provide, we need to talk with the FCC staff and Admiral Simpson about how many more weeks to leave this out here, but it will be available to review for comment. I was appointed to this in January, and yes, Steve, Admiral Simpson, I have a full-time job too as a state commissioner. This has taken a lot of time. This has been on a very fast time track. And so at least I have worked very hard to try to get something out there by last week. I apologize for the lateness of the notice to both members of the working group and people out there watching this on the webinar. But remember, I'm the first working group to report. Jay English still has a ways to go, and David Hall still have a way to go. And but as Admiral Simpson said, when we go through this today, we'll have about an hour and a half for this. Remember that work in progress, you have time for comments and edits. There are some typos, I know. There are some words that are probably not appropriate. I don't want to spend time today editing a document. What I'd like to do is talk more about the substance in each of the 10 sections that we have. We do have a unique challenge today, an opportunity. I really look upon this as an opportunity. As we see in other areas of critical infrastructure, and we had the benefit of Admiral Simpson coming to our NARUC meeting in New York City a couple of weeks ago, the telecom sector, the energy sector, the natural gas sector, the water sector, they're all converging. They're converging. And the same thing is going on in telecommunications with emergency communications. What used to be considered in one silo is going into another silo, and perhaps sooner than we recognize, all of these will be in one silo. So this group, I would urge you all to think about that transition as we talk about my recommendations or my group's recommendations today. We also have an international dimension to this. We have vendors at the table who supply products to Canada, Japan, Korea, Europe, all over the world. This, as we move to IP, this is not a domestic U.S. situation only. It's also an international one. Fees and collections. We'll get into this in this report, but we have a very outdated method of collecting fees, 911 fees, collecting the fees, the number of state agencies involved, and then actually getting the funds to the PSAPs, the public safety answering points who actually deploy equipment, who actually employ people, take the calls, and dispatch the first responders. But because of the nature of our federalist structure and the fact that there's some home rule states, there are some not home rule states, we have a very complicated system of fees and reimbursements for PSAPs. So this is quite a challenge to try to pull this all together in one report that's 40 pages long. We've tried to do the best we can. Technology innovation, I've already talked about that. I'm sure we'll talk about that more today. There are more competitive companies involved in this space. I, as a state regulator and a state commissioner, a state agency official, don't want to impede competition. We want to encourage competition, but we all know that public safety is a public good. There's no one group where you can talk about the benefits and the causes and try through cost causation to try to allocate benefits to cost. This is a public good, and we need to think about competition and technology innovation in that sense. And then, of course, I can't get into the details of outages. Admiral Simpson is well aware of 911 outages, but I think the 911 outages that have been occurring in states around the country with certain carriers and service providers around the country only illustrate the seams or the problems or some of the challenges that we have in the system. We also have the issue of rating, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Rating, diversion, sweeping of 911 fees in states for other purposes. You know what this all leads to? It all leads to a deceleration in NG, Next Generation 911 deployment, and this is not in the interests of any of us. So, if I could move to my slides, please. So if you have the document in front of you, you could just look at the document and then look at the PowerPoints as we go through here. In section 1 of the document, we call it Introduction and Statement of Issues. We just go through some points about what the problems are, what the issues are. We highlight that there are 240 million calls annually, a huge number of calls. And just as I said just prior to this, fee structures are very inconsistent, complex. And we were encouraged to be bold, I think, by Steve on a couple of our calls and others. I think if you put our recommendations on a continuum of cautious, moderate, bold, we're probably somewhere between the moderate to bold side. We are definitely not on the cautious side. So we were encouraged to be proactive. We talk about NG 911 is critical, and the fees on access lines and user devices are not sufficient. And then, as I just said, there is a deceleration. NG 911 deployment is not happening as quickly as it should. We looked at numerous studies on 911 fees and resource allocations. NASNA has done good work. Lori's program at the 911 National Program does good work. So we looked at all those studies, but look how complicated this is. 6,000 plus PSAPs, 50 state governments, the District of Columbia, tribal authorities, and others. This is not easy, folks. And we wanted to make our recommendations such that it focused more on execution and implementation. Okay, let's get into some policies and some high-level principles. I think you may have seen this before, but we amended it a bit during the outline in the beginning to now. Let me just highlight a few elements of this guiding principle. A 911 fee should be competitively neutral, assessed on all technologies. We say that is connected to a PSAP. And then we list the possible means of such a 911 fee. One would be in a subscription. It could be what we call in the wireless world postpaid. It could be a prepaid wireless plan. Or going forward, and I apologize for the typo there, on a unit of upstream bandwidth assessed on a provider. Again, internet access provider, whatever you want to call it, a communications provider that provides service, that is capable of connecting a 911 call. Here are the key functions that we talk about for developing an optimal architecture for the state. And again, we don't have the benefit of Working Group 2 and Working Group 1 recommendations yet, but we talk about some of those key functions. We talk about PSAPs being boots on the ground. We talk about state law, not federal law. It's important for all of us to remember that state law here is still primary. And then we talk about effective ways to engage other players that are in state agencies, such as the governor, the state chief information officer, the state budget office, revenue department, public utility commission, key legislators, committee staff. All of these people are involved in the fee and collection system, and we thought it was very important to write our report so that we communicated clearly to those people, not just people inside the 911 ecosystem. We're recommending some things on data quality and reporting. As many of you know, the Net 911 Act, passed in 2008, requires the FCC to submit a report with the Bureau at the lead to Congress annually. We think that some of the data and some of the quality of that data, and it's a collective responsibility, local, state, and federal government, but some of that data is not accurate. And therefore, we are not providing Congress with accurate data and analysis. So this is both a state authorities to PSAP issue and then a state authority up to FCC issue. So we're recommending that a third-party auditor review the data prior to Congress, prior to submission to Congress. And also third-party auditing is necessary at the state level because, as I said, this information is getting more complex. We have new methods of plans such as prepaid wireless and new methods of IP technology delivering service. Also in the executive summary, we talk about cooperative federalism. I'm not going to spend time on this, but basically this is a partnership. We talk about the transition to IP networks. The Commission, as most of you know, have a docket on technology transitions. It isn't focused specifically on 911, but we look forward to the work of the other working groups, especially on PSAP architecture and cybersecurity. Since we were asked to by the Commission, and commissioners in particular, we were asked to look at the issue of PSAP consolidation. And we concluded that just talking about PSAP consolidation, quote unquote, is not constructive. It's not useful. Again, the reasons are we believe in a cooperative federalist approach that involves state and local government that have primary jurisdiction over 911. PSAP consolidation, according to some sources, we haven't verified this for all facts, but we received some evidence that PSAP consolidation does not necessarily translate into efficiencies and cost savings. Also, we think that our recommendations as a whole, you have to look at our report, Working Group 3, and then as we weave 1 and 2 into this, we think that's a better approach that respects state and local government and is legally sustainable. We don't want to make recommendations that will be challenged immediately in the courts. And then consolidations are accelerating organically. Yes.
Question on the consolidation piece. And from talking to you earlier, I just want to make sure that I understand this right, that when you talk about consolidation not necessarily being the right thing for various states, I believe that was principally oriented around the people part of PSAPs, that the concept that in many states, in local jurisdictions, they would want the PSAP telecommunicators to be of the community, for the community, by the community. But that shouldn't necessarily mean that technical consolidation or the reduction in technical variation across the state isn't an appropriate near-term goal. That does have merit to reduce the technical variation and increasingly have a PSAP platform that can be drawn upon by multiple PSAPs. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do.
Thank you.
And then I'll stop after I get through all these. I think I have 8 points in the executive summary. I'll stop and open it up to questions. I think that would be appropriate before I get into section 3, 4, 5, if that's okay, Admiral Simpson and Steve. Okay. So again, we're in the executive summary part of the report. This is kind of at a high level. So what did we look at? We relied heavily on the NASNA study. NASNA has done some very good work. These are the National Association of State 911 Administrators. So they had 5 priority funding options. They actually looked at 20, I think. They discarded 15. They looked at 5. So we took up their 5 options. We modified them a bit, but I'll just run through them very briefly here. The first recommendation that we kind of landed on was a reliance on the 911 funding model with a network connection fee based on upstream bandwidth levels assessed through any carrier or broadband provider supplying a network connection to the PSTN or the public network. NASNA's recommendation was worded slightly differently, but this is probably our primary recommendation to transition. Again, this is a menu of options that we're going to state in the report. It's not mandatory, but this is where we landed. But of course, and Jason Jackson will come up to the table in a few minutes and explain some of the adjustments that make it both broad-based, legally sustainable. The details of this are going to be crucial. Kind of related to it, but kind of standing on its own is the prepaid, is the wireless model. As most of you know, I think about 70 to 75% of the calls made to 911 centers in this country are wireless. They're not wireline. We're getting more VoIP calls, of course. So the wireless issues are really important. We're spending a lot of time on issues like location accuracy, outdoors and indoors. But the funding model is still kind of, I would say, is not in sync with what needs to be done. We have a postpaid model and we have a prepaid model. Many states, like mine, are designating wireless, lifeline wireless ETCs, eligible telecommunications companies. This has been allowed by the FCC when they made a recommendation over a decade ago that non-facilities-based wireless ETCs could qualify for lifeline funding. So states have been very busy, and guess what they've been doing? They've been designating a lot of ETCs. And there are business models that have been developed around certain prepaid practices. So these prepaid wireless plans have kind of they've kind of, I would say, have marched in fairly rapidly into the 911 ecosystem, and they are causing a great deal of heartburn to all of us, I think, who care about 911. So there's been a lot of litigation on this. So 36 states, after litigation and heavy lifting on legislation, usually setting a fee in a prepaid wireless plan at 75, 80 cents or a buck. They've resolved it, either through legislation, usually through legislation. But there are still 14 states that have it. So we're urging that those 14 states get on with it, fix it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about more of the access, this network connection fee that would apply to all wireless carriers, and it really doesn't distinguish between prepaid and postpaid. At the bottom here, we're recommending that this issue be referred, ignore the word joint board, ignore the word board. This was a draft. We talked about it this morning in our group. I think what we're going to recommend, we're going to call it a joint advisory committee, but some sort of a joint advisory committee should look at these issues, both of postpaid and prepaid wireless and 911 fees. The other issue that we looked at is alleged under-recovery in the amount of about $275 million, according to some good analysis, that is being under-recovered from prepaid plans as opposed to postpaid plans. We did not make a recommendation. We don't think there's enough evidence in our record, as short as it is. This is not an adjudication, as we often do in state commissions, but it is a pretty serious allegation that I think several, if not many, of the 911 administrators believe that they are being, quote, shortchanged. They are not collecting adequately, both to maintain the legacy systems and certainly to move into the NG 911 future. So we recommend that this joint body look at that issue. The third option we didn't spend a lot of time on. This is one state in the country, Vermont, has a joint assessment system of Universal Service, TRS, 911. So we looked at that, but due to a variety of reasons, there's an ongoing joint board deliberation on Universal Service now between state commissions and the FCC, and the fact, I know for a fact that many of the states that have USF funds, either the legislature is promoting change in those funds or the state commission itself is initiating a rulemaking to either tighten up or change those funds. So we concluded that to be sustainable, we didn't want to rely on state USF funds. Fourth option. This is the option that many state legislators favor, to be candid. What about collecting from a state sales and use tax? Goes into the general fund. And then the 911 community fights for its, quote, fair share out of the general fund. We considered this, but there are 6 states that don't have sales and use taxes, and I think the overwhelming sentiment on the committee, on our working group, was it really needs to be a dedicated fund. If it goes into the general fund and the Treasury, we probably, the 911 community, will not get enough back, both to fund the existing system and the future system of NextGen. But we have to be honest with ourselves here. So the report, when we go out in our education and outreach to governors and state legislators, I think we all need to be aware that we will get pushback on this point. I think there will be a number of people that will say, dedicated fund, no, we don't like it. What about the general fund? But we are not recommending that. The fifth option that we looked at was some sort of a state insurance fee. Obviously, over 100 years ago, 80 to 100 years ago, the way Office of Emergency Communications got started was through fire and insurance policies for fire protection. And there were fees in the past that were assessed on insurance policies. But we did not spend a lot of time on this. I think 1 or 2 members of the working group made some initial inquiries to various people in the insurance industry, the State Insurance Commission, but we didn't go there. Another high-level recommendation, I've referred to it already, is education and outreach. I'm terming this a call to action. All of us need to get out of our offices, not saying that we don't do that already, but we need to make a concerted action to engage with those decision makers who are not necessarily experts in 911, but these are people who make decisions on funding of 911. So I've already mentioned these groups: state governors, budget officers, etc. And so what we're recommending is, together with the Bureau, Public Safety and Homeland Security, with the great staff that they have, and under the leadership of Admiral Simpson, that they should develop an outreach and education plan to decision makers that is timely and actionable. Okay, I'm going to stop here. So that's the executive summary. I'll talk about this joint advisory committee later, but does anybody have any discussion or any questions on the high-level points I've made to date? Okay, hearing none, I will proceed. Section 3, and I have to thank Mary Boyd and Jim Gorky for helping me out, especially with this one. We developed a set of policy principles, and we're just going to go through this. I'm going to put them up on the slides, but and I'm going to highlight a few. But the biggest one is sustainability. The 911 fee that we recommend has to be sustainable, and I guess stable relates to sustainability, and predictable. Predictable means that 911 planners have to be able to rely on a funding source to plan. It has to be reasonable, equitable, and non-discriminatory. It has to be accessed from all methods, all technologies, and types of communication services. It has to be technology and competitively neutral.
Before you switch,
Yes.
go to the next slide. Sustainable, predictable, stable, and then connecting that to technology and competitively neutral. I think, and I learned a lot from Jason in Alabama, and I don't know if Jason's here.
He's right there.
Yeah, there's Jason. Yeah. That in the tech transition, in fact, not just in tech transition, in the new technology world that we live in, the introduction of new functionality by which Americans communicate, going from voice now to text to images to Snapchat to you name it. It looks like as we go forward that those new functions and new services are being introduced at a pace that we've never seen before, and they enter the market, have some degree of lifespan, and then maybe exit the market inside the cycle by which a legislature might be able to adjust fees around the collections that support the budget for 911 call centers. Is that first part right? Is that and so the second part, I think what you're saying here is that we, as we go forward, in order to achieve that sustainable, predictable, stable, need to reconcile that vis-a-vis the pace of technology, and that part of your proposal here would be resource models that don't have to be readdressed every time there's a new over-the-top function that enters the communication landscape. Do I have that about right?
Yeah, if you want to weigh in here, that's fine, but I think we're trying to capture, we shouldn't probably mention names here, but things that travel over the top of the Internet as an application that is able to deliver either voice or a 911 call to a PSAP. Those technologies or those applications, we consciously didn't try to use the word application, but we try to focus on the networks, that those things should be picked up in the fee that we recommend.
Yeah, so that as Americans change the way they communicate, as the kinds of devices that would need to communicate with PSAPs evolves, that in the ideal world we would establish mechanisms that would account for that evolution without having to go back to lawmaking every time.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
Jason, would you like to say anything here?
It'll be explained shortly. But you are correct. We're looking at a model. How can you fund 911 in a all IP world? But currently, our funding model is based on an all legacy world, but shortly we'll get a little bit detailed on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, in Section 8, Admiral Simpson will get into the details, and Jason's going to talk about some of the adjustments and how we're going to try to slice it to make it equitable. So back to the slides, please. So we're on page 15. Continuation of the principles only used for their intended purpose. You can read these. What are some other important ones? This is important, that third bullet, sufficient for transitional provisioning and ongoing operational cost. Remember what I said at the beginning. The working group is very concerned that if this diversion, this sweeping, or if the states do not have adequate resources, and the PSAPs do not have adequate resources to build out NG911 in a timely way, the nation is going to be stuck with two systems for a long time. The legacy system, TDM-based, and portions of an NG911 system. So what we're trying to say here is there is going to be a transition, and there are going to be transitional costs, especially on the OPEX side, the operational costs, but I think the implicit message here is let's try to minimize those costs, keep the transition shorter. And then we talk about in the next bullet a dedicated fund, clearly identified and accountable. Section 4 of the report deals with previous studies and analyses. There are many of you around the table. I'm looking around the table now. Many of you have been involved in studies and analyses before. What we tried to do with our working group is not reinvent the wheel, but we tried to build on what had done before. We referred extensively to the good work of the FCC. I criticized some of the accuracy of the data, but I personally referred to those Net 911 reports drafted by the Bureau staff a lot because it gives you a good national snapshot of the monies coming in, the monies coming out. They may be off, they may not be totally accurate, but it is a good faith effort.
So, Phil,
yes.
You're referring to the state reports not being entirely accurate that we collate.
Correct, but I'm also talking about your report that goes to the Congress. I'm saying that the report under the name of the FCC, the chair of the FCC, that report is not entirely accurate, and it is a collective responsibility of all of us to fix it.
Yeah, okay, but it's the report that collates the input from each of the states, and you're suggesting that there may be a role for us in playing a quality assurance role on top of what the states submit to us?
I think we're saying two or three things. One is that we should hire an external auditor or external review to review the numbers. Mm-hmm. Two, the questionnaire itself, especially on the issue of, quote, diversion, is not accurate. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more that goes on. You need to dig deeper. So we need to fix the questionnaire, bring in some outside auditing, and then this joint advisory committee we recommend can help fix that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, am I on to diversion now? Page 17. I say, quote, diversion of funding, unquote, but our working group believes that these must be addressed on a state-by-state basis with the entirety of recommendations in this report. And again, I just had an exchange with Admiral Simpson about this being a partnership. This should not be an us versus them, PSAPs, statewide authorities, FCC, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. It should be a collective approach. But we need to get more transparency in these numbers if they're not correct. Legislators and officials need to make decisions on priorities in a very difficult budget environment. So my message to the FCC is we have to balance our budgets. The federal government does not necessarily balance its budget. But at the end of the year, on June 30th in my state, there has to be a balanced operating budget. And I think that's true for all 50 states. We don't have the ability to go out and borrow money. So these practices are occurring. The 911 community does not like these practices. But to label them diversion and highlight certain states and then perhaps hold them accountable under various programs is not a constructive approach. We talk a little bit about the role of the federal government, especially the FCC, in providing oversight of the carriers, a national vision, addressing the interstate and seams issues. And then we also talk about, I've gotten ahead of myself. There we go. That was it on diversion. Does anybody have any comments on, quote, diversion before we go to federal grants? That's Section 6 of the report. But Section 5 of the report deals with the, quote, diversion issue. We've had a number of very robust discussions, I can assure you, in the working group on this, Admiral Simpson. And personally, I have learned a great deal more about state budgeting practices that perhaps you don't know about. And even I don't know about. But there are things that go on, both transparent both transparently sometimes and sometimes not transparently, that take 911 funds and use them for other purposes.
So, and I hate to belabor this, but I want to make sure I understand. Just because the state isn't on that list of diverting funds doesn't mean that funds weren't appropriately used solely for 911 purposes.
Absolutely right.
Okay.
We don't know the absolute number because of the shortness of time. I really wanted to do a survey of these practices, but believe me, if these practices are being done in a non-transparent way, a simple survey or a questionnaire to a state official isn't going to get you an answer. This requires a more in-depth approach. But based on the evidence that we heard, there are financial techniques, I will call them, financial accounting and gimmicks occurring in a number of states with interest and principal, with sweeps to other accounts. And I should tell you, I'm a state commission. We have a penalty. I'll give you an example that's not 911 related. We have a penalty account. We have an enforcement action. We assess a penalty against a utility or a carrier. Sometimes these penalty accounts build up to $5, $10, $15 million. We've had a number of occasions where either the legislature or the governor request us politely, but it's not really a request, but with the help of the legislature, and they sweep that fund for other purposes, totally unrelated. So this is not just a practice for 911 that occurs in state legislatures. This is totally lawful. It's totally valid from a state point of view, but it occurs in a number of areas. Okay, I see Lori in the room and others. We're going to go to if I could get back on the slides, the federal role. And Brian, if you want to chip in on some of these, please do. Brian Fonts gave me a lot of help on this one in the working group. We talked in some depth in Chapter 6, Section 6 of the report, on the role of federal government agencies, and we think it's vital. Probably more on the CapEx side, capital, rather than operating. We believe the operating expenses of PSAPs and 911 authorities should come out of the fee, but certainly targeted funding on capital expenditure or CapEx is important, and as I said before, the FCC, the National 911 Program, DOJ, and these federal agencies, Homeland Security, play a vital role in giving us help and guidance. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it there. Brian, do you have anything to add? The working group, I think, discussed this morning, we're going to make some changes to the draft, aren't we?
Yes.
Please, so please, you might want to explain how we're going to expand on that.
Sure. One of the areas that we have to deal with in this is looking at a variety of funding approaches for 911, specifically looking at next generation 911. And those that know me well know that I like to interject a little humor, so here's my attempt. I remember my grandparents talking about President Kennedy drawing a line in the sand, and that's the humor. I remember him drawing that line in the sand, where he said that by the end of the decade we would be able to land someone on the moon and bring him back, actually. He did say bring him back. And I think it's important that we recognize that in a critical area like moving to next generation 911, that we as a nation draw a line in the sand as dedicating a date certain when, as a nation, we will have next generation 911. So to achieve that, it's going to require funding. And this is an effort that's both federal and state in nature. We talked earlier, Commissioner, about the federal-state cooperative effort, and in a number of different programs, there's been a state-federal partnership, if you will, in the interests of the public. And so we can take a look at a variety of different funding approaches. Some of these include taking a look at auction revenues beyond those monies that would go into the general treasury from an auction, to take a look at specifying some money for that CapEx issue associated with moving our nation into a next generation 911 environment. We're also examining the opportunity to take a look at where federal programs and grants exist today is 911 an eligible entity for any of these grant monies? And I know Dusty and I had a conversation when he presented this, the 23 grants that DHS has identified when he made his presentation to NIPSTIC. And to take a look at how 911 fits in those programs, either at DOJ, Department of Agriculture, DHS, etc. We also will have recommendations in addition to the ones I just mentioned that would require congressional interest, is to ensure we have a nation and a program that we are connecting all of our schools and libraries to broadband services. And it would be nice, too, if Congress were to deem our nation's 911 centers as a critical element necessary to receive broadband capabilities and provide support for that. For the 240 million plus people each year that rely on 911 services, I think that's a critically important thing. So we have some additional aspects that we will add to our funding concept. The notion of trying to set a date certain for moving to next generation 911, I believe, is critically important for a nation. As you mentioned earlier, Commissioner, roughly 75, 70, 80%, depending on your location, of 911 calls come from wireless devices. And as a nation, those consumers move from 911 center to 911 center to 911 center, and it would be in the best interest of the American public to ensure that all of our 911 centers are next generation 911 centers. So that date certain and the funding for it are critically important. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Brian.
Commissioner, if I could, first, thank you so far for your very thought-provoking comments. And to Brian, thank you for the suggestion, if you will, or the challenge of a line in the sand. As we know, because we've spoken about it before, this is the 47th year of 911 as we know it. And there probably are still pockets, very small, in the nation that still don't have 911. But it took us many, many years to get to the point that most of the nation had 911. But that was then, and this is now. And I think the opportunities that are associated with the next generation of 911 is certainly opportunities that no one in this country should want to wait another 40-plus years to be able to enjoy. Because quite frankly, the technology will so rapidly advance that before they can ever enjoy it, it'll be something in their rearview mirror. So I really applaud the concept of a line in the sand that will at some point in time be related to the many recommendations, which we recognize again are simply draft recommendations, draft options that you guys on the work group are putting forward today. Thank you.
Question for Brian.
Okay.
Want to make sure that I have the right optic on this. I think a line in the sand would be very useful to create here. The consequence of not having a line in the sand, one of a use case for that may be cars in the future. Some cars today, when an airbag deploys, send a note to 911, to the 911 operations center. If we're not careful with next generation 911, that report will mean something in some of the counties in the country, but would mean nothing in other counties in the country. And you would drive across the country and have widely different service potential, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, because we have a very ragged approach towards achieving next generation 911 capabilities. Is that, do I have the right image
Yes.
of what would happen without the line in the sand?
That's exactly right. And then on top of that, when you don't have a line in the sand, the limited resources, in this case money, to operate both the existing 911 system and E911 systems, while you're attempting to get the money to deploy next generation 911 systems, can in fact lag on for years. And we've had discussions in our group where some states are creating a pool of revenues to deploy Next Generation 911, only to have that money not spent on Next Generation 911 because that pool generates interest that are then swept into the general treasury. So there's a disincentive to spend the money or invest in Next Generation 911. So I absolutely agree with your point in terms of just a quality of service for the American consumer wherever they are in the country or wherever they may be traveling through as they make their way across the country. And I also look at it in terms of value of time to money and ensuring that these public safety entities called 911 are not going to have to be taxed, and I use that not in the regulatory sense, perhaps a bad choice of words, but they're not going to have to devote resources to run one system while they're attempting over a multi-year process to implement another system called Next Generation 911. So it's the idea to try to move into that Next Generation 911 environment by a date certain so that there is actually a savings associated with that process. So both are true.
So it's not just the burden of funding two separate systems for an extended period of time.
That's right.
But there's also a greatly increased risk exposure because those two systems naturally will have interdependencies.
Right.
And a failure in one would implicate the other. So not only would we be paying twice as much for an extended period of time of not effectively resourced CapEx for Next Generation 911, but we would be exposing Americans to greater risk of 911 not working because we would have the probability of failure of the two systems multiplying and increasing the chance that there would be an outage or other issue.
That certainly is a possibility. And what Commissioner Jones has reiterated about making bold statements, which is actually originating from Steve Souter, be bold. By drawing a line in the sand, we are being bold. By making some of the recommendations for funding, we are being bold. And it's going to require obviously a heavy lift beyond certainly our working group, which has no authority over funding, to states and federal government to ensure that some of these recommendations or proposals that you'll see in the final report will make these types of bold but critically important recommendations to work toward that date certain, that line in the sand.
So if I could, I'm going to wrap this up and we need to move on. This is not a consensus of the working group yet. This is Brian's proposal to the working group. We haven't landed on this yet. And I also want you to note, according to your own report submitted to Congress last December, only 5% of state funds are being spent on NG 911. We still have a major issue just keeping the legacy systems going. Basic 911, as Steve said, we have some areas that don't even have basic 911. I don't think it's the intent of the working group to deny basic 911 service, or even texting, which doesn't require NG. Texting can occur, as you know, over these legacy systems. So it's a more complicated question than that. We need to vet it a little bit more. We do want to be bold, but we want to be balanced as well. If we could move back to the slides. So in the report, the first draft of the report was actually stronger than this. And then I heard from members of the working group that we needed more of a best practices approach focused on functionality. When we first started talking about this, we were kind of discussing very strong, legally built state 911 authorities as we build out NG 911 throughout the state, that would be the best way to establish the institutions and the governance in the state. But as we talked through the issues, we thought that a more balanced hybrid approach would be better. And if you want to look at your report, it's on pages 20, 21, 22 of your written report. So we refer to certain states, and we are not biased to members of this working group, but Dana's state of Minnesota, Jason in Alabama, we cite to North Dakota, and then we cite to Jim's state of Texas. These are all states that have a 911 authority, but they also have regional bodies for certain metropolitan areas in particular that are very effective on planning and coordination. And there are also rural areas in those states. So what we're saying, instead of just a one-size-fits-all, this is the right approach, strong state authority rather than strong county, we're suggesting, if I could use the word hybrid approach, with strong regional bodies focused on these principles that you see up here. Long-term planning, minimum standards, develop an optimal architecture for the PSAPs, use the concept of shared services among both primary and secondary PSAPs in the state, develop consistent programs for workforce development, and then ensure that PSAPs and regional bodies and states develop governance and accountability within the state. So that's where we're landing on what we're calling effective statewide planning and coordination in Section 7. Now, here's the heart of the report, Section 8. So in Section 8, we, as I said in the executive summary, we spent a lot of time on two areas, what we're calling a network connection fee on upstream bandwidth, and then we spent some time talking about the prepaid wireless. So the network connection fee, I'm going to turn this over to Jason to explain a little bit more about the details, but basically we are reducing the number of carriers that would be subject to collection. That's an important difference to the current system. We're assessing it on a network connection rather than on an access line or a device such as a phone or a tablet. And we're trying to be technology neutral and sustainable. So we're trying to reflect those principles that I said at the outset. So Jason, could you talk a little bit more about the details and how this is structured and the number of carriers that would be subject in your state, and just give us an overview?
Thank you, sir. Part of the thing when we were looking at how do you fund a next generation 911 world, clearly in the current model, based on legacy system, it makes it incredibly complicated. We all have examples of how we have tried to advance as technology advances. The reality is, for example, in Alabama, 23 connections per T1 line. Well, by the time I get that passed, or the legislator passes it, and then we all can agree on it, well, I'm 3 to 6 years behind technology again. And so one of the things that we all recognize that we have issues with, but one of the things we're trying to avoid is continuing to be behind the 8 ball. As technology advances, funding is right there neutral with it. It's constantly, if one takes a step, the other takes a step. And so when looking at that, we made some assumptions. One of the assumptions is being that the FCC continues down the path of possibly requiring over-the-top apps to connect 911 services. Other web-based services that connect to 911, video messaging or just through some device, if they're mandated to connect to 911, then how do we begin to assess a fee on that? And kind of broadly thinking about it, just kind of give you a better idea that there's 3 options you have. You have one, you try to go after every over-the-top app. You try to change legislation to assess a fee on each one. You then try to assess a fee on web-based services that are trying to do the same thing. Second option you have is you put it on the devices. The problem with that is it's a very volatile market. You cannot predict what goes forward. The problem with the web-based app or placing it on an app is we have a hard enough time enforcing for carriers now. I see it as virtually impossible to enforce on app services going forward. And I think consequently to that, either of those methods, we actually indirectly discourage technology advancing. The very thing that we're embracing, we're now trying to discourage if we were to try to fund it in such a way. And so all that being said, the one thing that we have in common, both in the 911 world and the other vendor world as technology advances, is the connectivity to broadband. The very thing we're wanting to move to, and many of us are trying to move to throughout the country, the very thing that allows them to eventually access the 911 system is that connectivity to broadband. Examples, over-the-top apps in the future. You currently have cellular devices that can connect to 911 by making a phone call over a Wi-Fi enabled system. So they're not using their actual plan, they're using a Wi-Fi, which essentially makes it a wireless VoIP phone at that point in time. such things as that. Currently, they're accessing a 911 system, and they're not paying a 911 fee. If you were to have a home that had internet only, had a Wi-Fi system inside of it, the cell phone makes the call, but routes it through their Wi-Fi, they're connecting 911, and there's no way to assess a fee currently in that model. And that's becoming more prevalent as more providers of phones and carriers are moving to that model. So how do we assess that? And that's where we decided if you place a fee on the broadband connectivity, clearly there's a legal argument, and you'll see in your packet. We believe that there is a possible out of the Internet Freedom Tax Act. There's Section 47. There is a paragraph that clearly states that gives 911 the authority to assess such a fee on a system that is only for 911 purposes. So we were able to kind of deviate the legal aspect of it. From a implementing aspect, actually I think it simplifies the problem tremendously. You then, instead of trying to assess every possible over-the-top VoIP provider, nomadic VoIP provider, any over-the-top apps, assessing any web-based service, all the carriers involved, you in Alabama, for example, you have 185 companies that we currently assess a fee. And the reality is we're going to drop that dramatically, 15 to 20 actually who are providing the connectivity to assess them. And so from an enforcement standpoint, we simplify the process tremendously from just the ease of use for all involved. It simplifies the process. Last thing we want to do is invoke such a burden on the carriers who are accessing the 911 system. I believe this simplifies it for them as well. I've spoken with many in our state and some in other states that it is different. But in the end of the day, as technology advances, this is the one thing that remains neutral, simplifies it, and works across all board. Best example I have right now, we're trying to collect 911 fees by throwing a fishing rod out and trying to catch every line. For the first time, we're going to throw a net.
So, Jason, thank you. A quick question for Jason. Is this a proposal in Alabama, or this is now law in Alabama?
No, it's a work in progress in Alabama.
Okay, so you're evolving to this.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I hope.
Yeah, got it.
And then a couple other points. We discussed this morning in our working group. We are probably going to be asking the FCC to put this in an order. That you have that states are able to assess on bandwidth a network connection fee of this type. So this is going to be an ask. I'd like you to write that down. That's an important point. We believe we have room under the ITFA, the Internet Tax Freedom Act, through its 911 exception to run with this, but we're not sure. And based on the litigation on prepaid and other issues, we think it would be very helpful for the FCC to clarify this for us. The other thing is we are not prescriptive in terms of states. On page 26 of the report, if you'll refer to that, we lay out 4 options on how to do this. We are very well aware that any new assessment methodology will have, quote, hair on it. It's not simple. And people will try to game the system, as non-facilities VoIP carriers have tried to game the current system. So we lay out 4 options. One is dividing the nominal bandwidth connection in kilobits per second by 64. Another one is adopt a presumed number of VoIP connections per 1 megabit a second, such as 10 connections. And then we get into some of the commercial and high upstream bandwidth users, but we kind of landed on 1 megabit a second as being kind of a default. And that's consistent with some of the orders coming out of the FCC on the Connect America fund on the 10.1 and other standards. So, and again, this is kind of a work in progress. But Jason, do you have anything to add on that menu of options of 4? Or I know Joe, there are others around the table who may want to weigh in here.
The menu of 4 is just it really more of an example to give you an idea of thinking toward that process of thought process. It's a different way of thinking. It's a way of funding 911 that's never been done before, clearly. Not one that's most popular at first just because it is so different, but it just kind of gives you an idea of the different possibilities of how to assess a fee, a 911 fee, on broadband. I do believe those four will evolve over time as more discussions around this subject are discussed and analyzed and so forth. I believe we'll come away with more options and hopefully one day a better one.
Yeah, I know there will be great interest as we talk about funding options in the other side of that coin, and that's the controls to ensure that we're being efficient in that spend and controls to make sure that this isn't an ever-expanding line of expenditure, that we're doing things to lower the cost, like what we're going to hear, I think, from Dave Hall's group and from Jay's group, that the cost containment is as important as fixing the revenue model. And I think if something doesn't go forward with both of those, it's kind of dead on arrival.
Well, I hope it's not DOA. I hope it's not dead on arrival. And I can assure you, Admiral, that states have accountability on this. Counties do as well. So in my state, there is a very strong E911 advisory committee, and then it has to go to the state legislature.
Yeah.
So it has to go to the state legislature. So believe me, there's the carriers and other interest groups weigh in heavily to cap the fee or adjust the fee. So you have the legislative, what I call the legislative sausage making, that is sometimes not entirely optimal. But more importantly for this community, you have very strong mechanisms in place already through statewide 911 administrators, PSAPs, and some sort of, as we recommend in our effective regional and state coordination, you have good accountability mechanisms there. So I would prefer that it be done on the state and regional level. Now, we do have this Internet Tax Freedom Act at the federal level we have to deal with, too, and I know you at the Bureau, you're under the gun, too, for accountability, but I think we're doing a lot already, but, we take your point that more needs to be done, and we probably need to coordinate, and maybe this joint advisory committee between the FCC, state, and local can help ensure and help you back here with Congress. Okay, I think I only have 10 more minutes, and Dana, I think, Dana, you're going to get mad at me if I don't stick to the break, so. Oh, Tim does. Tim, David, okay.
You have 10 more minutes.
Let's go to prepaid wireless. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Frankly, our recommendations here need to be fleshed out a little bit more. There may be a little pushback from the industry on this from initial indications, so we'll just wait and see during the comment period. But as I said at the outset, there are 36 states that have resolved the issue. 14 states haven't. So that's how we kind of break it down, 36 and 14. So the 14 states that haven't resolved the issue, they should get on with it and pass legislation that probably either goes to a POS, a point-of-sale fee with a retailer, or moves, if they want to be bolder and think ahead, to go to a network connection fee based on bandwidth. So we spend some time in the report talking about that. So there's a short-term solution and a longer-term solution. We also spent some time talking about the alleged under-recovery of prepaid wireless plan fees. The 911 administrator in Kentucky has done some excellent work. We think it's credible, but some people disagree with the analysis, that about $275 million is being, quote, under-recovered from prepaid wireless plans. He's done a lot of work. We think it deserves more scrutiny and more justification, and we basically say that this joint advisory group should take a good hard look at that. So I think I'm going to shorten the prepaid wireless plan issue, but in some states this is getting to be a substantial. Jason, what was the number in Alabama? You said prepaid wireless is 20% of total wireless?
24% of total wireless. Some carriers as high as 46%.
And Dana for Minnesota, is it up in that range, 10, 20%? Yeah, it's getting to be a substantial issue. So this alleged under-recovery hits certain states relatively more than others. And so we have to be careful because certain states think, and PSAPs think they're getting the right amount from the track phones of the world or the Virgin Mobiles of the world. You know, all these wireless, Lifeline-only wireless ETC that states have designated. So anyway, it's just something that we think needs to be looked at in more depth. This is an important point for you, Admiral Simpson. Remember at the last meeting when we were talking about the Georgia PSAPs, I said I would be happy to go down with you to Georgia and testify before the state legislature. So this is one example of education and outreach, but I say that somewhat in jest. But seriously, we believe the 911 community needs to develop a more systematic and disciplined approach to decision makers, not us around this table, but the policymakers and the budget makers in each of the states. So we talk at some length about what those groups are, the National Governors Association, NCSL, I think, the National Conference of State Legislatures, is an excellent one to reach out to. The Council of State Governments is a good one. In my state, the CIO, the state CIO, is getting more involved with FirstNet, emergency communications, cybersecurity. He's very interested in cyber and will take an interest in cybersecurity for 911. So we need to make an effort to reach out to those folks. So again, scratch the word joint board in that last bullet. Just think of this as a joint advisory committee. And finally, the Joint Advisory Committee that we're thinking about, we think that this could play a useful role in a number of areas that we've talked about today, both in funding and even perhaps governance and accountability. This would be a group created by the FCC. It would be a mechanism by which the Bureau, you all, the staff, NASNA, NARUC, APCO, and don't forget Nina, we think something like this is long overdue. So this report, as we said, is a call to action for the 911 community, and we think we need a sustainable mechanism by which we can have a dialogue. So it's a very productive and constructive way of keeping the dialogue going. And that is the end of my presentation. And I think we have a few minutes for Q&A or further discussion. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to certainly open this time up to those that are both in the room as well as on the bridge. Are there any questions for the Commissioner or Jason from those of us that are gathered here today? Yes. Anthony, Tony.
So, Tony Montani, Verizon. I guess a comment. I think we all applaud, number one, the report, Phil, and certainly the concept of simplifying how fees are captured and collected and cast in a net. I like that comment, Jason. That's very appropriate. Those are all good approaches. I guess my comment would be that when it comes to looking at it from a bandwidth perspective, I think the trick is how do you do that right? Because when you think about the bandwidth, I look at bandwidth from a carrier perspective, and I think that's evolving as fast as the applications that are riding on top of it. So, I'm not sure what the right approach is. We didn't get into detail on the 4 options that are in the report, but when you think of how quickly bandwidth is changing, the individual users, bandwidth to the home, we're talking 100 meg plus now to a single home over fiber or whatever. I just question whether that's really the right approach.
I think it's one of the things where the carriers are more involved they are, the better off we can come up with a solution. My initial thoughts is in order to make it equitable, if you take a percentage of that, so if you just take a 1% fee on whatever that bandwidth is, let's say for Verizon, so if you connect a home to 10 or 100 or whatever it ends up being, it's equitable throughout. That 1%, it grows and goes, it lessens or grows as depending on the need of that. Same thing with businesses. If a business has only 15 lines, they're only not going to need a ton of bandwidth there. But if they have 1,500 lines, the more bandwidth clearly they'll need. That 1% or whatever, the 8% of that, again, it grows and lessens as it needs, so it's more equitable across the board. I think our biggest concern there is just the advancement of how much can transfer over 1 megabyte. I don't think that's probably a next fix 10, 20 years from now. I don't think it's a huge thing now, but I think this is one of the things where we need the carriers in the room to sit down and really hash it out.
Yeah, and Jason, I would think a fixed percentage would be a bit problematic because, as Tony pointed out, just because people suddenly start watching movies over, and we need more bandwidth for that, and that may be 10 times the bandwidth than pre-movies over the internet, that suddenly PSAP should get 10 times as much as they're getting. I think that there needs to be we really need to identify what is the problem we're trying to solve here. We're trying to provide the predictable, sustainable revenue stream for 911 and not a penny more.
Right.
So if you start with that and then back off on there's an adjustable percentage that would ensure that gets met, I think that would be better than some open-ended fixed percentage that would be applied. Tony, was that kind of your point in the bandwidth increasing so rapidly?
Yeah, I think the bandwidth to the home is changing all the time. So I'm an engineer, right? So I don't think about these things too often, but it seems to me that the market determines what the consumer is willing to pay, and that amount that they pay is probably really the approach to figure out what's that fee need to be to support the 911 infrastructure, as opposed to the bandwidth that the customer is using, because that's not necessary. It's related, but it's not a direct correlation. How much they're paying.
It doesn't correlate with how much they would need or use 911 services.
Right. Correct.
Got it.
My rebuttal to that is I agree. We don't need to overfund the system. However, for the first time, we're going to have more people accessing, or more points that are you could access a fee into the system. I personally think a fixed percentage would drop in less. We would have every state, mine included, and I know we're one of the higher ones, but even Florida with 40 cents, I think percentage-wise that would drop tremendously, just because again, for the first time, the net's bigger. We have more people paying a fee into it than we do now. And right now the fees are having to go higher each and every year. I know several states too, in particular, just went up again more than 10 cents this past year, because it's harder to figure out what a connection is. That pool gets smaller, and everybody we can put a fee on, the number keeps rising, and that's one of the things that we're running into. And as far as I think that's a business model that the carriers need to really look at. Yeah, my home internet only it says up to 30. I probably only access 10 a month. I'm about to get emails on this one. That's not my problem. And I'm trying to fund and fully provide the best service I can for the citizens of Alabama, as each of us here today are doing as well.
May I comment as well, please, Admiral? So back to something that Jason touched upon and others have said. In Working Group 3, it's certainly not our intent to create a model that overfunds. But what we are trying to do is create a model that is sustainable and funds also as we move into the future. Because I think it's pretty clear that as next generation 911 gets built out, just as the amount of bandwidth is ever changing, bandwidth to not only the home but also to businesses, the amount of bandwidth that the PSAPs will need, the amount of money that they will need for new and different types of non-traditional content, that's also going to be changing. So the model, while we don't want it to overfund, we also don't want it to be short-sighted in that it doesn't sufficiently fund as content increases and more money is needed for public safety to provide service.
Thank you, Jeff. A great observation. It's time for a break. We've been allocated 15 minutes. I certainly am open to starting 5 minutes earlier if we can narrow it down to 20 minutes. So we'll see you back here at 2:40. Tim?
This is Tim May. So where we stand now with respect to Working Group 3 and the report, Working Group 3 had some productive meetings this morning. We've had continued dialogue here. Working Group 3 will now take this back, make sure it's incorporated into the draft, into the report, towards a consensus document. Once we have that in hand, that report will then be distributed to the full membership for your review. We'll provide you with a reasonable amount of time by which to weigh in and with your structured edits or comment towards then a vote in a month from now, or perhaps we wait until the September timeframe. So that's the rough outline for moving forward now with respect to the product for Working Group 3.
Thank you, Tim. On break. I began to develop a sense shortly after the beginning of our effort that the 3 work groups that were established by the Commission were exactly on target in so far as the 3 broad areas that were important to consider. But I also recognize that in the work group that we just had reported out, there were opportunities that did not necessarily exist in the other 2 work groups. I view the work group that has just reported out to be one that is more of an opportunity to give food for thought as to what I'll describe as public policy, as opposed to food for thought, as opposed to technology or architecture. As we hear from our next 2 work groups, I think we will quickly come to realize the interdependency of the 3. And not to give any more importance to any one of the 3, but it is really the effort of Phil's work group and the recommendations and the options and the alternatives that it provides to our decision makers will, in my mind, go a long way to assist in the implementation of the technologies and the architectures that we're going to hear from next. Public policy is something that we all deal with. Those of us in local government, state government, and even our vendor community that are at the table with us as well. I truly believe that our elected officials want to do the right thing in this regard, but I also believe that it's incumbent upon us to assist them by giving them the options and the alternatives, both in architecture as well as policy development. How is it going to be funded, etc.? They deserve that. It is going to be as challenging for them to make the right decisions that it is going to be for the technology implementation and the architecture. So as we move forward with Work Group 2 and David's presentation on architecture, I think we'll quickly come to realize this interdependency and how, as we look forward to the conclusion of a final report, how we may want to look with a fresh eye both at the timeline for that and how, whether or not those 3 independent reports are perhaps better to approach as a whole rather than do it in a segmented way, which made a lot of sense at the very outset. But as we have all learned so much in this process, it may be better to look at that with a fresh eye. David?
Admiral, got it.
Some more line there.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to sit here today and give kind of an interim overview of where Working Group number 2 has come and why we are where we are and where we're headed down the road. Working Group 2 was tasked as the optimal approach to next generation 911 architecture implementation by the PSAP. So that's the direction that we were tasked. All the members meet on a weekly basis on a conference call, speaking to the dedication of this working group, many of them, because we've now split down into, and we'll talk about this as we go forward here, 3 separate subgroups under that working group number 2. And those 3 separate subgroups also have weekly conference calls. So everybody's doing double, sometimes triple duty as we move forward with this. So we thought it was important today to kind of step back a little bit and lay a foundation for where we are because of where we've come from, which then also speaks to where it is that we're headed. So let's talk a little bit about the 911 system in the nation. It's been advanced since about the 1960s. 911 standing as the sole number for notifying the public through a public safety answering point when an emergency occurs and a caller needs emergency assistance. That current system is based on a telephone network that existed in the 1970s, and it was illogical to use a feature known as selective routing to support the implementation of 911 calling nationwide through central offices, phone company central offices. So that ability to deliver those calls was really utilizing what was known as operator services functionality. The advancement of 911 as the 3 digits that you would dial in order to get emergency assistance was backed by Congress and by the industry, and it spread across the nation. The percentage of U.S. population that was covered was, back in 1996, only 17%. And then in 79, by 79, it had risen to 26%. In 87 to 50%. And by 1999, 93%. And today, about 96% of the population nationwide is covered by dialing 911. And Nina provided the source for that information. There were milestones in its development. By 1979, only 9 states had enacted 911 legislation, and there were 70 new systems per year that were developing approximately. By 1999, there was almost 89% that had what's known as enhanced 911, again, from information provided by Nina. So what is the circuit switching selective routing for 911? Well, it's existed now for over 40 years. It's routing through telephone company central offices, as I mentioned previously. It involves customer devices that rarely moved without administrative control. It was on wireline, essentially, technology. Telephone numbers were correlated to a physical dispatchable address in a database that was held by those phone companies. So your telephone number subscribed to a specific address, and in that subscription, when you called 911, it routed back, and you knew from that database where that location was. Then came into play cell phone technology. It existed as early as 1973, but it wasn't until the mid-1980s that the next major step occurred in that mobile telephone technology with first generation, or what we call 1G, fully automatic cellular networks introduction. Wireless began the 911 paradigm shift. By 1983, the FCC had approved the first mobile phone. By 1985, PSAPs received calls from mobile devices. And as numbers became more mobile with the device, you were no longer able to receive callback and location information initially. Telephone numbers to dispatchable address correlation was no longer valid because now it was a moving target. It was not back to an address on a street where a residence or a business was correlated. So part of that shift also was the mechanisms had to be developed to force mobile E911 into wired landline model. So the first stage from the model of wireline into wireless and the mobile calling capability. So there was a stopgap measure, essentially, that was added. That ensuing technology advancement and cellular deployment actually widened the gap between technology and the solution. So as we now are at the point where we're moving rapidly into the IP evolution. So that 40-year-old switching systems across the United States now teeter on the edge of obsolescence largely. Telecommunications nationally moves into the IP world. And IP networks are versatile and the basis for delivering these next-gen services largely. The requirement for a clear understanding due to the rapid evolution of technology supporting 911 becomes critical. There's been a lot of written about next generation 911, but in many ways there's not just a lack of overall comprehensive understanding and a roadmap, but we think Working Group 2 believes in our discussions that there's a lot of fog surrounding this whole notion of what is next generation 911, what are the critical core elements of next gen 911, and if I'm a decision maker, how do I build that system in a way that goes back to what our core mission is, and that's building the optimal environment for that. So we also believe that there's a requirement for this roadmap largely that will include a single resource for information. And that's not to look at some of the works that have been done to this date. There's been some great migration documents done by a number of agencies, actually, that are in this room. That work is, at the time, was groundbreaking. But some of those documents are a number of years old at this point, and there's been a lot of things that have developed in terms of standards revisions, network understandings, and a lot of technology that has come forward that we're at a point where this working group and this task force can provide some tremendous add-on information as that's moving forward. So the question we wrestled with, which was part of our charge, was what is the optimal architecture for next generation 911? And all of the discussion boiled down to what does the word optimal mean? And at what level do you apply optimal? We figure that the goal for Working Group 2 is to assist decision makers as they take a look at what is optimal, what are the choices that they have to make, what are the design and configuration issues that they will have to come to grips with, and what are the key decision factors that they will have to make with a broader understanding of what's the impact of the decisions moving forward. Because, as Phil mentioned, those decisions all have cost factors associated with them. But it's not just about the finance, it's also about the quality of service for next generation 911 and for the caller. So we asked additional questions. What is the optimal architecture for next gen 911? But then also, is there one best optimal design? If so, what elements are required as a part of that? And then if not, what combination of configurations are required? And we talked a lot about configurations. In fact, if anyone who looked at the first presentation we made to the task force, we had initially started thinking in terms of state, regional, local configurations, and that's how we originally had organized this working group. We came to understand that it really is not about that type of an entity or entities in discussion, but it's really about what are the core basic products that come into play when you're building a next generation system, and how can you configure those core options in order to create the optimal environment that it would be in. And that may differ based upon a whole variety of factors, including political jurisdictions, including available dollars that are available, that are in terms of operational considerations as well. So back to what are the combination of configurations. The challenges to 911 decision makers, really the list on the previous slide, is a subset of the questions. What's the requirement to synthesize competing information with limited best practice guidance? We're really blazing new territory here with the whole next generation 911 concept. And with that comes a lot of confusion sometimes. And when we get to the EZNet group, there are folks who say, well, I have an EZNet, I'm next generation 911. And that's just not the case. And Tony will talk to the fact that that's the network. That's not next generation. So there's been a lot written, but that's where the confusion point comes in. What exactly is next generation 911? What are the core components of it, and how can you configure all those in order to create an optimal environment? So Working Group 2 believes, through all of our discussions to date, that there is not one best design, there is not one best choice, but rather there's a number of options that can be chosen for optimal architecture in 911 systems. Working Group 2 also intends to create a roadmap to identify what the core components are and then detail those components out into potential configuration choices so that decision makers, whether they be government authority decision makers or whether they be PSAP directors or regional authorities or wherever that authority system rests that has to struggle with the question of what is that optimal thing. If I'm spending money on this and I'm making a commitment, what is the optimal considerations that I have to come into play? And that roadmap, hopefully, what our intent is to lay that out in terms of a report. And it's a great work in progress. So essentially, we divided with that understanding and those discussions into three subgroups. The one was access and next-gen 911 core services. Another was PSAP CPE, which involved the terminating equipment, the 911 call taking, mapping, the GIS component, the CAD component, and then the dispatching piece that goes along with that. And then the third subgroup was emergency services IP networks, or the ESI net. Each subgroup is tasked to research, do some analysis, and then have discussions pertaining to their subject areas, and then develop drafts of the anticipated final report sections and recommendations. All of those things are works in progress. I mentioned earlier we hold weekly conference calls of the entire working group in order to do reports and solve issues or answer questions and have essentially the ability for each one of the working groups to go over. And when I say that sometimes it's more than 2 calls per week, there are members of this working group that sit on a number of these subgroups, which creates great cross-pollination between the subgroups, but it's just that much more of a commitment that they make to the process. So it's been moving along. Where we started, and many of you saw the first rendition of this, when we took a look at configuration options, this is how we got to where we are. So I'll ask Jim Gerke to kind of talk about this diagram and then also what the access subgroup is doing.
Be glad to, Dave. This was actually the access and next generation 911 core services subwork group is chaired by Roger Hickson and Mike Nelson. Unfortunately, neither one of them can be here. This is Roger's diagram, and I think members of the task force have seen this diagram in an earlier version at our first get-together. It represents in a graphic way the roadmap that Dave was talking about and how we've organized ourselves to address our task. You'll see there in the different colors, groups of 3 different colors, the 3 subgroups that are involved. Our next task, after we identified those, and based on what we felt would be the logical way to begin to address the different configuration options that exist, then our task was to kind of identify those that were, those options that would logically be in place that 911 authorities might approach or attempt to deploy. So that's what's above the different blocks. For example, above the access block, and by the way, access in this context does not mean consumer access to communication services, but rather originating service provider access to next generation 911 systems. So, but for that access point then, our thought was, well, logically that could occur at a state level or that could occur at a sub-state level tied in with how those next generation core services are deployed. And then the same holds true as you work your way through the balance of the table. For the Next Generation 911 Core Services block, for example, maybe in the Northeast where you have a number of relatively small states that conceptually there might be a deployment scenario where those states work together to deploy a system, and then, or it could be at the state level or again at a sub-state level, and so on and so forth. That's how that table works, and I think both of the other subgroup, Mary, and Tony, you'll work off of that as well. The ESI net's on there. I'll let Tony talk about that. As far as the access subgroup, it's really the access / Next Generation 911 Core Services subgroup. We've identified potential configuration options, and we have begun to kind of identify what we feel like are the strengths and weaknesses that are associated with those different options. Anything else you want me to add, Dave, on that?
That's good.
Okay.
Mary?
We'll turn it over to Mary.
All right, thank you. As Dave pointed out, we combined one of the subgroups where we're focused really on the equipment that's residing within the public safety answering points. I'd like to point out that our team has a very strong and active participation by public safety, and I want to thank them all for that effort. In fact, one of our members, if Larry Hatch is on by Conference Bridge, I just want to acknowledge Larry actually retired a couple of months ago, but he continues to participate and helps us, brings lots of expertise, so we thank him for that. Just an update, our team is focused on what we refer to as Section 3 and Section 4. If we could, yes, thank you, that slide. Section 3, we are actually recapping public safety answering points, an overview of that, the equipment that resides within those public safety agencies, and have narrative for, once again, the assisting decision makers with understanding operations and interoperability. We're currently focused on Section 4. This is where we begin to move into PSAP optimization, either from a PSAP who physically consolidates or describing how they can function operationally in different brick and mortar, but they share and optimize a network and the elements within that. And so we're currently in the process of working through Section 4. It will also include the operational structure, where some of there are elements when you consolidate the brick and mortar resources and certain efficiencies that are gained. But we have a strong respect for the states and local government and how they operate and dispatch emergency services. So we will continue. We recognize time is short, and we also want to put a plug in for giving us a little more time if that's possible. So I think, Dave, I've hit all the high points on that, and I'm turning it to Tony now. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Tony Montani again from Verizon. So on the EZNet group, it's important, as we've gone through this discussion, to understand what the EZNet is and it isn't. And the EZNet is that foundation. When we looked at that network diagram earlier, EZNet is the foundation of all of the services. So we're not talking about the services and applications that are riding it. It's really the platform that provides that connectivity. So the EZNet really focuses on having that reliable platform that whatever decisions are made in terms of what the core service is, what's going to be done remotely, what's going to be done at the PSAP through the CPE, that it has the right platform to ensure connectivity. Again, we're not looking to define the EZNet. That's been done. We're going to leverage the existing documentation. It's really about providing some insight and factors on how you optimize that EZNet depending on the geography and the factors that each group is dealing with. So we look at the different criteria. We talk about certainly the architecture is a key element. So what interfaces need to be provided, how many PSAPs are part of this platform, what kind of demarcation you're going to have between those entities, the operating companies that need to connect with it, are all factors that we have to consider. And especially, the reason we have the EZNet is to have a more robust, more reliable platform. So you really have to think in terms of the redundancy, diversity of that network, to make sure that's reliable and it's always operating. And if with the IP-based platform, you have a much greater opportunity to avoid that outage than you did with maybe a traditional TDM and the legacy technologies that have been around for the last 30 years, as we mentioned. Define the uses, for that EZNet again, and it's really around the connectivity. What is it really there to do? Who needs to connect to it? How do you connect, et cetera? Having the right operational metrics is a consideration. We need to make sure that we have the right grade of service, that we know if there's any kind of packet loss on that network, and that we're prioritizing the traffic across it. Certainly considering the legal and regulatory requirements, especially, again, around what do we have to do to ensure diversity across these circuits to the various PSAPs. We've talked at a couple of points today about how a lot of the subgroups are really related, and between Working Group 1, 2, and 3, there's a key to really tie it all together. And here, when you talk about security, Working Group 1 certainly looking at the cybersecurity aspects. The EZNet's going to be part and parcel with that. How do you secure that network? How do you control access to that network? And how do you respond and react to an event on that network? So that's really the focus of Jay's team, but certainly the design of the network is going to be affected by it. And then finally, management and governance. This is an observation I have, in my time here working across some of the next-gen applications. It was maybe a little bit more simple in the past, where you had the operating carrier was the person that had the 100% responsibility. Now we're entering into an environment where we see application providers and we see other players that are taking piece parts of the applications and developing products and developing solutions. And it's great technology. And again, gives much more functionality to that desktop. But having the right structure to coordinate and control that environment, whether it's a county, whether it's a PSAP or a service provider, understanding the roles and responsibilities, how we manage that environment, how we react when there's an issue on that platform is critical. So these are things that the EZNet team needs to take a look at and at least make sure that that's in the minds of the people that are out there making the decisions on how to build these networks.
Tony, a quick question. Is it right to think about EZNets as being able to support one EZNet, one PSAP, but also one EZNet might support several PSAPs? You could have a statewide EZNet that supports multiple PSAPs. Similarly, you might have a PSAP for a very large jurisdiction that might choose to have multiple ESI nets, either backup in a primary or because of a geographic distribution, a need for multiple ESI nets. Are any or all of those models possible under what you've pulled together so far?
Well, I would say with one exception, right? Mm-hmm. One EZNet and one PSAP, that's probably not a model that you're going to find, right? Because the reality is when you talk about developing an optimal architecture and you're talking about leveraging core services across a number of users, really the whole intent is to find ways to create that architecture that shares the infrastructure. So you are talking about EZNets that need to communicate with each other. So we need to, again, leverage the existing documentation, make sure that we are following those interoperability guidelines and to make sure that these networks can talk to each other. Because it won't be necessarily one network per state or one network per county, but you need to have the ability to interconnect them appropriately and have that really, I think we know when we talk about a transition, you're going to start somewhere. So in that kind of an environment, you're going to have EZNets that you're going to develop, deploy, and then need to possibly grow. So there's all kinds of applications.
So I think that's a very key point that of the three that I described, it sounds like fewer EZNets supporting more PSAPs is the right trend.
Yes.
So a PSAP is typically defined by a jurisdiction. We're now talking about an ESI net that crosses jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. So it essentially has a shared services component to it. So in what you're looking at, I would imagine it includes how do you affect governance for a shared service that
supports and provides capabilities for multiple jurisdictions.
And the other question is who's managing that ESINet, and how are they interconnected? Because there will be touch points for ESINets for transfer of calls, transfer of data, transfer of dispatching information. So a system of systems largely is going to have to develop and be in place. And that might not just be within a state, because there'll be some cross-state relays of data as well. And theoretically, if you have a misdirected call that comes into one state, because, I mean, and we see this happening in PSAPs now, somebody calls their relative who lives in another state and says, I'm having chest pain. And so rather, who does that person call under the current system? They call their local PSAP. And now they have to somehow make notification to multiple states across the line, wherever that other person lives, to say, my relative lives in this location, can you please send an ambulance there? In a next generation world, and that's what we have to talk about, a lot of standards happening on the NINA side as to how you make those data crossovers. But, how do you get that call information other than finding that PSAP, calling them up, and doing a hard transfer now? In a next-gen world, you shouldn't have to do that. You should be able to push it right to that PSAP. But where's the demarc? Because network owners, like to make sure the security of their network is in place. And, where do you do the firewall crossovers, or how do you build that interoperability piece in order to compensate for that? And that'll be a critical piece moving downrange.
So this is really helpful for me then, where we had in legacy PSAP terms a network for every PSAP. We are now seeing multiple PSAP supported by a single network. So we're seeing technical consolidation now, and we would expect to see more technical consolidation in the future while retaining the people part of every jurisdiction having their own call takers. Is that right? Am I looking at that right?
The way I guess I would answer that is the technology used to be all contained within the PSAP in many cases. You had the CPE, and you had a selective router somewhere that got the call there, but all the intelligence was there. And now you're talking about a model that says the PSAP is going to have a certain level of functionality that's to be decided in part by the PSAP, and then it's going to have a number of shared services that are going to be remote from that PSAP. That the only way to optimize it is to make sure that those shared services are used by many PSAPs.
And Admiral Simpson, the part we're in right now is describing how the PSAPs could either be, a single county interconnecting into, shared services arrangement, or maybe you have a regional system. So we're in that process right now of defining how those communication centers will look and do look today, and even to the point where some of them, we have PSAPs that cross state boundaries. So in the Section 4 is where we're going to develop all of that narrative, and then we're going to talk about pros and cons of how these systems operate in, as a consolidated PSAP or a PSAP. Maybe it's a PSAP with brick and mortar, one facility, but you have police, fire, and EMS are operating independently within that center for their dispatch protocol, but they all will work up into an optimized network, and then from there we'll talk about what's in that network and what they share. So we're going to get to that detail.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Dave, back to you.
And Mary, thank you for mentioning that, because even though at this meeting and routinely we think of the ESINet as supporting just the next generation of 911, but I think, to your point just a second ago, as we begin to educate and inform the general public and particularly the electeds, that my understanding is that the ESINet, emergency services, really would be a network that could support more than just 911. There could be other public safety emergency service applications that are equally as important that could ride on that network. So the investment in the network is really to serve even a broader range of emergency service deliverables than just the 911 component.
The ESINet is really a network. And the core components or the applications of the next generation 911 technologies will ride on that network. But it could be other factors as well, not just 911. And a whole variety of applications could be coming out that ride on that are basically supportive of public safety.
Yeah, so that is a very important point, and it gets to governance, right? So that if 911 funds are used to also subsidize, if you will, other public safety functions that aren't necessarily 911, but it sure is a heck of a lot more efficient to have them supported by a single network. How do we approach that from a governance standpoint to ensure, when we ask the question, are 911 funds being diverted because a part of that spend helps other functions? I think we need to be able to answer that question so that, as to Commissioner Jones's point earlier, there needs to be crispness so that we're not saying that, well, the state that efficiently organizes their ESI to handle these other functions isn't suddenly accused of, you're diverting 911 funds.
So to wrap up for me, just the last page, in terms of where we're at, continue to work on that the factors that would contribute to an optimal design. That's part of the team's efforts. Document those assumptions and work across the other subgroups to make sure that we're coordinated as far as how our recommendation comes together. And with that, I'll turn it back to Dave.
Thanks, Tony. So to just kind of to recap as a summary, what we're trying to work to identify, what are those optimal factors? What are the core components, essentially, is part number 2 of a next-gen 911 system. What are the designs then, the multiple potential designs of that optimal architecture? Because it really can be regionally based. It can be in a whole variety of different ways. When we talk about configuration, a variety of ways to configure those core components in terms of who maintains control and or service of those. And shared, hosted environment, cloud environments. There's a whole variety of different ways that they can be pooled together to provide, quality, optimal service. And I said the configuration variations then that could come into play. And what are the scenario options that are available? There's been a number of jurisdictions throughout the country that have moved forward. There are no currently next-gen 911 fully deployed systems, and we've had that discussion, even though some folks look at it and say, I'm next-gen. If you break it down and you look at all of the individual requirements from I-3 into the variety of different areas, there's none currently. But how do we get from here to there, and what would be required if there was a checkbox that says, these are the things I need to do in order to be next-gen 911? That's essentially where this working group has to work towards producing that in their final report. So that if I'm a decision maker and I have the funding to support it, and I have a fiduciary responsibility essentially to do the best dollars towards a solution, what's the solution going to be, and how do I get from here to there in a way that provides quality service to my 911 callers, whoever they may be, whether they be residents, whether they be visitors passing through my community or whatever. And so part of that fundamental thing then is to do this roadmap guidance and then cast that out as a challenge to decision makers to say, here are your options to consider as you design your system, basically. And we know that ESINet is one of those roadmap pieces. We know that the telephony system associated with the next-gen piece is one of those systems. We know that GIS is a critical piece to that as well. So that's collective database management largely is a piece to this. And then we come into other applications too, CAD sharing, the ability to dispatch other jurisdictions' units associated with it, however they would work that out operationally. But those are the kind of things that we're not going to define, and we're not going to say here is the best way to get here, but we are going to say these are the pieces that you really have to take into consideration if you're going to move forward with a solution of sorts. And then ultimately, we're going to have to talk about governance to some extent, because however they decide to do that, and there's a number of different options available, that has to be factored in, because there has to be authorities who have the ability to plan, to implement, and to move forward with whatever that plan is. So the group's done a tremendous amount of work to date. Very proud of what they've accomplished, but there's a lot of work yet to do. And with 8 weeks till the 29th of September, that's going to be a real challenge. So, but the report's moving along. The other piece that we have to do is take a look at the sections of the report as they're defined currently. And especially after this morning's meeting, we have to have some discussions about what are the gaps in assignments and what else we might want to add into that report in order to accomplish what we talked about today. So with that, I would open it up for questions to any member of the working group.
Dave, Phil Jones here. Brian brought up the point earlier about a date-specific for NG 911 deployment across all 50 states, and that being part of maybe something we could do in Working Group 3. Listening to you talk just now, and maybe this is, you and I need to talk offline, but what defines full deployment of NG 911? If we put that line in the sand or a benchmark in that, would it be on that roadmap somewhere along the road? On the roadmap, are we looking at things like GIS network, CPE, GIS systems? Could you work out some sort of criteria if we decide to put that in? I'm not saying we're going to put it in, but if we decide to put that in, it seems to me we could argue about what constitutes full statewide NG 911.
And Phil, we understand too that there's a lot of dynamic interplay that's going on. Even Nina's come a long way in standards development over the years, but we know that there are a couple of things that they're still working on too that'll factor into how we transfer calls, and some of these component pieces. Do I think that we can define what the core components are and help with some of the fog that might be there? Yes, I think we do. We can. I think we can do that by the end of whatever our work period is here this fall. We'd have to do some more discussion among us as a group and maybe among all three working groups as to whether or not we could realistically set a target date. I think we can say if you define a next gen 911 system and you have a map to do that, some of that's going to be dependent upon how you build that system and what locally how much money you have in order to put towards it, what your funding sources are. So there's a lot of unknown factors that we could set a target date and then manage how we get towards that target date. I don't know if we could hard and fast say 3 years from now everybody in the entire country is going to be next gen, because I think that there's a lot of things that are still unknowns in that process, no matter what kind of good work we do in order to define it.
I think part of Phil's point was that regardless if there's a line in the sand or not, the description of are you at next gen 911 is important. What is the minimum criteria for that? Is it being text capable? Is it being capable of receiving images around a specific incident and cataloging those images? And I would add that I think one of the minimum criteria for saying we've achieved next gen 911 is the retirement of legacy operations. So you're no longer executing that parallel spend, it would be very useful to develop what constitutes that initial next gen 911 we've arrived criteria.
Yeah. Am I still using databases that are legacy databases to dispatch, or have I switched to essentially GIS routing or pointing? I think that's absolutely true. Those kind of things are really the touch points for you are at next gen or you are not.
And if there's a laser focus on cutting out legacy spend, because every time you cut out legacy spend, there's an opportunity to repurpose for what you're trying to build for the future.
Well, and you raise the cost. because if I'm supporting a legacy network and system, and I'm supporting a next gen, I'm now spending money on both. Whereas the narrower I can make the transition from legacy to next gen, the less I'm spending. Two separate. I'm basically not funding two separate systems.
Thank you, Lori Flaherty.
Just something to think about as we're moving forward with this idea of what is included in that definition, the line in the sand, and when you get to next generation 911, I would, when that checklist is formulated, I'd be very interested in it because, we are collecting data from the states at this point, and the data that we're collecting is more process-oriented in terms of where the states are. But, as we develop the next version of that data set, if it could be added to include that information so that we can keep track of how the states are doing, I think that would be extremely helpful. So, we're certainly open to that.
Any other questions? Anybody on the bridge? Yes, please. Pull closer, Bob.
I'm sorry. One, I guess even if the state or the PSAP entity is next gen compliant, if the vendors or the OSPs are not sending in the PITA flow or the data that's necessarily I3 compliant, it's you can state that you're a next gen system, but you're still not functionally a next gen system, I guess. So I don't know where you would, where do you define that timeline? Because I could turn on and be compliant, but only have one vendor submitting the right data I'm looking for. So I'm gonna have to still maintain the legacy system until all the OSPs can send me the right data. So it may not be in my realm of responsibility to make that happen.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I'm advocating that for the minimum criteria, it would be that you can eliminate that legacy spend. So if you haven't gotten the OSPs, if the OSPs haven't changed what they're sending to you yet, so you can shut down legacy technology and the sustainment dollars towards that, then you haven't achieved the minimum, that first line in the sand that Brian was advocating for having achieved Next Gen 911. It's got to include the elimination of the sustainment responsibility for legacy.
Thank you, Bob. Any other questions? We're going to move on now to work group number 1 and Jay English. Jay, as you recall, and I said at the outset, had a very, very extensive report the last time we met, and certainly there's been an ample amount of information about the importance of cybersecurity in society in general, and government in particular, since that report. Jay, we're very anxious to hear an update from your work group, and thank you.
Yeah, we'll see if this works. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you to the Commission, Admiral, and the Bureau. I'll be brief, believe it or not, because we have very little time. I'll start with an observation. There is no one sitting on this side of the table with the cyber guy. So there's two reasons for that. One, because no one wanted to sit next to the cyber guy, or two, the cyber guy didn't want to sit next to anybody else. And that's kind of the way you have to look at cybersecurity. There are a couple of different ways to slice it up. Either you segregate your network from everything else, which makes your network very ineffective, or your network selectively decides who it segregates against and who it integrates with. And when we look at cybersecurity, those are the two ways we really have to approach it. We can make PSAPs sound and secure and safe and lock them down from everything and everyone, and we will never have a cyber attack. And we will never have Next Gen 911 because those networks can't talk to each other. Or we can selectively decide what areas of the PSAP and the 911 authorities and the ESI nets and the carriers and the service providers do talk and how they talk, and we can define those interfaces. And then we will have we'll use the term optimal architecture for cybersecurity as best we can implement it in a real situation. I'm an operations guy. So reality is
We will not build an indestructible or impenetrable network. What we have to do is try to do the best that we can. That's what this working group is tasked with. So we can go back to the slides briefly. We have a draft document in progress. Next slide, please. Draft document in progress that basically addresses a couple of different things. What is the cyber risk today and how do we handle it? What is that risk going to look like tomorrow? And what are some of the changes we need to make? We've been tasked with incorporating the NIST framework and deciding where specifically that applies to public safety versus where it applies to government versus where it applies to industry. And there are a number of intersections and there are a number of divergent areas, and we have to decide what those are and how to marry it up. We'll also review the CISRIC 4 recommendations, incorporate those into the document specific to public safety needs, and we'll leverage existing work, again, from NIST, DHS, the industry, NENA, APCO, and CISRIC. I would have to point out there's been mention of NENA standards a number of times, and those are incredibly important to the development and deployment of Next Gen 911. There are other standards efforts that are also important that are being considered by the Cybersecurity Working Group that include the NIST standards and the NIST work, some work that may not be a standard but is considered a best practice in the DHS arena. APCO and NENA and ATIS are working on standards that focus on interoperability, whether next-gen, legacy, or a combination of the two. So there are a lot of players involved when you start talking about next-generation 911. And when you start talking about cybersecurity, each one of those players has to operate from the same set of rules. You cannot interconnect a PSAP from one city to another, let alone from one state to another, without an agreed-upon set of rules. And those rules have to apply universally if you want to interconnect and maintain some kind of safe network. This group intends to sort of set a framework, limit the amount of work that the local jurisdictions have to do, and to Admiral Simpson's point earlier, come up with, similar to what Working Group 2 is doing, a centralized approach. We're not suggesting a consolidation. What we're suggesting is the use of these core network services, specifically around a cyber core that gives local PSAPs a single point of contact for cyber issues. Today, if a TDOS or a DDoS or another type of attack occurs, the PSAP is basically on their own. There are resources out there that many of the PSAPs don't even know they can contact. There are not centralized resources that can monitor, prevent, detect, mitigate, do all of those things that you have to do that the NIST framework very clearly defines, and we will use the exact same terms as NIST and NICE and CISRIC use in our report, but all of those things have to be done. They don't necessarily have to be done at the PSAP level. They have to be offered to the PSAP as support and as part of the overall picture. To that end, there will be a section in the report dedicated to workforce training, specifically around the NICE framework, also developed by NIST. It is incredibly important to remember that you are only as strong as your weakest link, and your weakest link is always that link that is uneducated, not strengthened, not properly integrated. We can't let that link be our people. So workforce training and the practice of proper cyber hygiene is important. An entire section of this report will be dedicated to that. We have a subgroup formed, and thanks to the help of folks like Bob Brown and April Heinze, that subgroup has some substantial input from public safety. Initiative, unfortunately, this slide was changed and I didn't get the updated one in time. There are 3 initiatives in our group. One of them is the high-level cyber strategy. The other is what we just talked about with the NICE framework, and a third is a checklist for PSAP, similar to what Working Group 2 is doing. In addition, we have a concept that we are not prepared to give you a diagram for today, and we're still working on this in conjunction with some of the options being done by Working Group 2. The concept is the PSAP Security Operations Center, or PSOC. The idea here is, again, to leverage some existing resources, whether it be at a state level, a regional level, or in some cases even up to and including federal resources, to provide services to the PSAP in such a way that you can monitor traffic, and I'm not saying monitor someone's phone conversation, I'm saying monitor high-level traffic from wireless or wired consumers who are trying to access 911. You can monitor the 911 center's traffic back and forth across things like the EZNet. You can determine if an anomaly has been injected into the system. You can then start to take steps to identify a potential attack early on. You can mitigate that attack with the assistance of state and possibly even federal authorities. And at the same time you're doing that, whether it's rerouting traffic or whether it's identifying certain segments within that PSAP that need to be blocked, you can start the forensic gathering of data for the eventual investigation. None of these things will happen unless we find a way to centralize the monitoring, the intrusion detection, and the prevention. There are good federal and state models out there. We need to use those models. We need to use the NIST framework. We need to educate the workforce, and we need to put options in front of local decision makers so that they can figure out the best way to integrate their local operations, which are clearly the most effective for the local population, into the state and potentially federal partnerships that we can form to get more tools in the hands of the local responders more quickly and more efficiently than if we were to try to do this 7,000 different times. Yes, sir.
Jay, thank you for that. I 2 weeks ago was up in Albany, New York, and visited the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the Multi-State ISAC. DHS originally provided the seed money, teamed that up with the NGO, the non-governmental organization, the Center for Internet Studies, which has a great checklist on the hygiene things that enterprises need to do to affect cyber. News to me up there was that they now have achieved connection with all 50 states, and that DHS has provided essentially the Einstein sensor. The name for an Einstein sensor provided to a state network is called Albert. Go figure. There's at least 2 Alberts in every state. Some states have kicked in and significantly increased that, but those are intrusion detection systems, intrusion detection programs that now are on at least one state network managed by the state CIO. Do you envision then that this PSAP Security Operations Center would be aligned within the state framework, feed up to either the state CIO's security operations and or possibly have those anomalies fed up to the multi-state ISAC?
A good question, and one of the reasons I did not put the diagram in front of the group today. I think that there will be a couple of different options for where that PSOC may reside, but that having talked to DHS and some other agencies, the Einstein model is actually one of the models that we think is effective in this cyber realm from the PSAP perspective. Another model to look at is what has recently been integrated into the NCCIC from California and the California OES, which is a monitoring application using deployed sensors. So we can have a single sensor, or we can have 2 or 3 sensors, or we can have a sensor array. And really, the model in California creates a sensor array using the PSAPs. And you can gather intelligence and information on the health of a network. That, in conjunction with something like the Einstein model, gives you the ability to monitor and then to detect potential intrusions, and it also gives you the ability to mitigate those. So there are 2 things, not only a multi-state ISAC, which is an excellent concept, but there are fusion centers in all the states. And the fusion centers have connectivity, but it's not universal yet to PSAPs or to agencies. eventually I think what we will see is we will see under the necessary move towards data sharing and information sharing, I think what we'll see is we will see state and regional level authorities coming together to connect that intel at the level that you're talking about. And I think we will also see, or we should hopefully see, a combination of resources like ISACs and fusion centers and the Einstein models and the OES models that are out there, so that rather than operating in vacuums at state levels even, or at PSAP levels like we often do today, we'll end up having true integrated communications, not only voice and data communications, but the ability to monitor and manage and protect our networks. That is more centralized, especially from a cyber perspective. If there's one place that you can take advantage of core services and a distributed architecture, cybersecurity is that opportunity.
Yeah, it would be really helpful if this working group put together a roadmap that was reconciled with what we're seeing coalesce around the states. Kansas is a great model. The Kansas Intelligence Fusion Center is very mature. It'd be silly for a PSAP in Kansas not to connect to it.
We're all getting a WIA, right?
Yep.
WIA works, once again. Yeah.
I thought that meeting was 2 weeks from now. Who put the EAS meeting in here today?
Be careful when you replay this. Don't use that tone.
So to your point, sir, I think that the idea of a roadmap and our idea of the checklist for the PSAPs and what they need to do to be prepared and how we intend to structure the recommendations around cyber all gels pretty much with what the Working Group 2 folks are doing. And what we want to give you is an integrated product that says here are the options for the PSAPs, here are the optimum ways to use any one of those options and plug it into these options in the cyber realm.
Great, because we want to, at the end of the day, be speaking to community leaders that make decisions around budgets and state leaders that make decisions around budgets. And cyber is fuzzy enough that if we're not pretty crisp about what those two should or could be talking about to be efficient in this area, then I think we've missed the mark.
Yes,
thanks.
Thank you, Jay. Any questions for Jay? On the bridge? Jay, thank you again. Very intriguing, as it was last time, and it is every time on your working group teleconference.
Behind you.
Do you want to take it?
Yeah, I didn't see it. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Please identify.
My name is Alfredo Bocanegra, and I represent 911 Rescue Corporation. Question is, taking a view at the future, the way forward, and the opportunity that apps bring to the table, have we investigated how we can certify and accredit new applications that would interface with the back end of the 911 system? And from experience, I know, for example, for the military applications, they use DISA for authority to operate, in the military field. Can we leverage some of that processes to accredit and certify new technologies to operate in a network such as important as 911?
If that's from the cyber perspective, I could say that I don't believe we're going to get that level of granularity in the cybersecurity report. We're going to keep it more at a high-level network rather than down to an individual application or specific vendor type of recommendation. So from the cyber perspective, I would say that's outside the scope of what we're looking at.
And I would suggest from a process standpoint, there's a 911 application working group that we have charted that I think you're a part of, that would be more appropriate to work within that working group. It certainly would need to fit into the framework here, but the certification and what would constitute an app being considered a 911 service provider is something for that other working group.
Right, and I agree with that, sir. I'm just wondering from the points of insertion, where it could be availability to the back end that would be something that might be considered as an investigation point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Final round of questions or comments. Before we wrap up, and I'm most interested in doing that at the 4 o'clock hour, predicated upon some travel plans, and I know many of you have, but I'd like to take the opportunity to revisit, if you will, our timeline. As you may recall, there was a date posted of September 29th for the final meeting of the task force to report out. And today's meeting was, in fact, originally intended for Phil's work group to be voted upon. As we have all found, this is a monumental undertaking. And as we have delved into our respective fields of responsibility, I think I'm comfortable in saying each one of us have recognized that this is a big, big undertaking. And because we are who we are, and I will use this word because I believe it, we are the brain trust of 911 in the United States of America in this room, to do justice to our charge, Admiral. I'm comfortable after having talked to my work group chairs and their respective members that we believe that more time is required to produce the product that you charged us to do. How much time is a little bit difficult to say. But in some sidebar conversations, which I had the opportunity to have just before this meeting began, there is an understanding at the commission level that for us to do what we are obligated and committed to do will probably take more time. What I would like to propose is a revised timeline, but in so doing, I certainly want to hear from each of the respective chairs of the work groups as to whether or not you really believe it's a fair timeline to achieve the level of finality that you're hoping to do. I would propose that our September 29th meeting remain, but it have a different focus. It would be another opportunity for, at the same meeting, all 3 work groups to report out and to provide back to us the status of their effort at that moment in time. And then sometime probably in the month of December and before the end of this calendar year, there be a new final date on which we would return to this table in this office, and we would at that time, in fact, present our final work effort. In between that and following the APCO conference in the middle of August, there may very well be a small meeting of the work group chairs that would happen to be attending the APCO meeting, so that we can benefit from having a physical presence and a check-in. Now, that's only a couple of weeks away. But to Jay and to David and to Phil, I would ask each of you, is that a proposed alternative modified timeline that you're comfortable with and that you believe gives each of you and your respective team the opportunity to bring this to the level of finality that we're wanting to do? Phil?
Since my report went first, I'll give you my comments first. I would like to wrap this up as soon as possible, but provide adequate public notice for people to comment on it. So here's what I propose for my working group. We will have at least 1 call in August, maybe 2. When you have edits and versions of the report, please send them to me, and I will edit sequentially and probably get out reports sequentially. Given my vacation schedule and other commitments that I have, I would like to wrap up the final report by August 28th, end of August. And then we would vote, or we could vote by email, we could have a conference call for a vote, I don't know which. I'll talk to Tim and David about this in terms of FACA procedures, but we would vote sometime in the following week. So I'd like to get mine wrapped up before Labor Day. So I would give you September 4th as the date.
David?
Steve, we certainly agree that in discussions we've had that we don't think we would be ready by the 29th of October. We certainly could provide another interim report, whether it be December or something else. We haven't discussed how long after that, so I think we would leave that open for some additional discussions. But I think at some point, we'll see where we get between here and there, but I think at some point after the 29th would be appropriate. We just have to kind of narrow that down as we move forward.
29th September.
September 29th, right. Yeah.
And Jay?
I'd concur with Dave on the 29 September date, and we'll work with whatever the determination is, the entire committee, on what the end date actually needs to become. On the 18th of August here in D.C. during the APCO conference, there is a room available from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. If folks are here and you want to have a meeting, we've got a room available for a meeting, but obviously we wouldn't be voting in that 2 weeks. It's just there's a room available. If members of the committee want to get together and chat, it's certainly there, and I can send the room-specific information out, and that's been reserved specifically for TIFOPA members. Again, the 18th, 10:30 to 11:30 hours.
Thank you, Jay. Back to Phil. With your alternative date of September 4th, and hearing what your colleagues have said, do you see any wiggle room there on your part wherein perhaps your own timeline could be accommodated, but the final report being voted upon more in keeping with the timeline that incorporates the 29th of September and something beyond that?
So it would be open for public comment and further revisions for about 2 months?
I see Tim has grabbed a mic, and thank you very much for that, Tim.
I think that's a little bit on the long side, frankly. But
just to clarify, public comment is not necessary. It's more that the working group reaches consensus on the product. The document is then shared with the membership at large. Their feedback is incorporated, but we must have a public meeting at which the report and recommendations are voted on and approved or sent back to the working group. That has to be a public meeting. Now that can be finessed with people, whoever's in town, for example, in the APCO time frame, as well as Conference Bridge. But essentially, the membership would have reviewed the document at that point and be prepared to register their vote, yea or nay.
Just a clarifying question. When you say the final report, is that the report of each working group, or is that the final report of TFOPA?
We're talking about your final report, Working Group 3's final report.
Okay. So that has to be voted on or approved by consensus in a public meeting at the FCC.
Well, the first thing is that the working group has to present a report to the membership that represents its consensus view and recommendations. Then the membership has the opportunity to look at it, and then that report is then presented for full membership vote at a public meeting.
Okay.
But I would add to that it would be the expectation, I believe, that working group's report be harmonized with the other two. So the full group would vote on Working Group 3's report, but the full group would also vote on Working Group 2's report and Working Group 1's report. And what I'm hearing from the chairs is that the working groups their products do have interdependencies, such that you would want to at least know where the other two are heading before you would vote on any single report. Unless I misunderstood that.
Well, back to your question, Steve. Yes, I am amenable to holding this over until a final TFOPA vote on September 29th, but I'm telling my working group members that I would like to achieve consensus and final editing to the extent possible before the Labor Day weekend, if possible. And to your point, Dave, I think I'm hearing from Jay and Dave that they will just have interim reports by September 29th and an update, and maybe another month or two after that for the final. So I don't think it's entirely reasonable to make a demand on us to fully incorporate every recommendation on ESI nets and what we talked about today, because they're not going to be final yet.
Yeah, so I'm not suggesting that they be final, but I think there needs to be enough of an understanding of where they're going so that the group can consider that in a vote for any one of the three. I'm not saying that all three votes have to occur in the same meeting, but we are looking for a coherent recommendation from the task force, not from a working group.
So you are, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, I'm just trying to repeat, you are amenable to the next full meeting of the task force being the 29th of September, at which time the working groups will report out 1, 2, and 3, but that a final vote will occur sometime after that, and I would prefer sometime before the end of calendar year 2015. But your working group effort will in fact have been completed.
Yes, I'm comfortable with that.
Dave, okay? Jay, okay? Okay, for the record, Tim? Thank you. Okay. Very good. It is, guess what, 1,600 hours Eastern Daylight Saving Time. Thank you all once again, not only for being here, but for what you do every day, and certainly what you do as a collective effort for this body. Safe travels, and I hope to see all of you, or many of you, in just a couple weeks, just a few blocks from here.
And we are adjourned. Thank you.